tomorrow. I don't know. I think we have a session. I'm not sure. Is he doing fundraising? I don't know. The title is suggested. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الصلاة والسلام على محمد النبي الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد. Some of you might have heard the name of Professor Wael Hallag. But just for your information, it's rare that you have an Arab Christian to embrace Islam. And there are two who really have broken this taboo, and they are at the forefront of carrying and presenting Islam at different levels. One of them is Munir Shafiq, and the other is Professor Wael Hallag. It's interesting that Wael Hallag is a very well-respected academics in the West, and Munir Shafiq entered a Syrian jail, a Christian Arab, a Christian Palestinian, and a communist, and he came out of the prison after many years as an Islamist. In fact, he got to the point of being the head of the Islamic National Conference that used to be active in the 90s and afterwards. So those two individuals really have big contribution to the contemporary Islamic thought. And when this book came, The Impossible State, it created waves and created lots of discussion at the time. And we say Jazakallah khair for Brother Hassan Baloch for the planned presentation of the book and what was surrounding it at the time when it came out. So without delay, inshallah, we'll go to Brother Hassan.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I will. What happened to my? Yeah. So as far as context, the book came out in 2013, maybe some of the reaction I'll rely on you, Brother Hisham, inshallah, to talk about that later at some point. But essentially, it was well regarded. First of all, who is Wael Hallag? He's a professor of humanities at Columbia University. As Hisham mentioned, he's originally Palestinian from Nazareth. And he studied Islamic law mostly in the West at McGill University, in Canada. He's a Canadian citizen, where he was professor of Islamic law, and he's written a lot of books on Islamic law in general. This book, first of all, it was obviously well regarded. It won the Columbia Book Award, the award they give for best book for their humanities department in 2015. And it still remains, a seminal work on the underlying theories and differences between Islamic governance and the modern state. So the book is very dense. It has a lot of ideas. It's not like full of stories. It's not full of anything that's easy to read. So you'll forgive me, some of the things they're all concepts. So we have to think about, you have to be ready to stay awake for some concepts, and inshallah, hopefully I'll pause. Everybody has questions in the middle. But his fundamental thesis for this book is very simple. And that is, he's saying that the idea of the state is a modern invention. It's in his words, a Western European invention. And the Islamic form of governance, and that's what the word he preferred to use, is very and totally different from a concept of a modern state. So, in fact, he criticized some people for getting stuck in the paradigm and the language of the Western conception of what a state is, and even this word, although he tries his best to say the state is a Western concept, even he periodically in the book you'll see he's slipping, and he calls something related to Islam as state. It's hard to stop using this word, but he was basically making this point that there is a modern state. It came from a Western European origin. It was birthed in the Enlightenment. It came from a struggle that Christians went through. And it has very little to do with how Muslims govern themselves. And unfortunately, he says that the state apparatus was basically shipped throughout the whole world, causing a lot of problems. So that's the basic thesis, and we'll get into the details of that. So it's not a big book. Let me see if I can copy. So this is what the book looks like. It's about 170 pages, but very thick, in concept more than the length. And the actual, somebody I was listening to a podcast, he said that this cover is actually an impossible triangle. So maybe, I'm not a physicist, but maybe Brother Hisham has seen this before. PDF, I don't know. I'm sure you can find it. It's been around since 2013, so it's 10 years old. I'm sure if you Google this and put PDF, somebody has made it into a PDF. But it's not very expensive. You can also just purchase it as ebook or regular book. So it has 6 chapters. There's an introduction and conclusion, and then an analysis and comparison. The first thing he talks about is that there's all these Western concepts of state. And what is a state? How is a state defined? And really, what is the nature of what a state is? So he goes through these series of like 8 different philosophers from Western ideas. For example, Karl Marx. He says the state is a function of economic dominance of one class over another. And then, there are other different definitions. This person named Schmidt, he was actually a member of the Nazi Party. But he's a very influential political theorist. It's interesting. And he says that power politics is really the real basis of the state, meaning power is the basis. But anyway, what he says is that all these theorists come together looking at the state from different angles, but ultimately they're viewing the same concept, and just it's still bound within a certain Western mindset, but it's looking at it from different angles, but still in the same overall concept of what a state is. And that's not something that he says that what Islam should be striving for or was in the past. So what are the properties of the modern state? He says there's a constitution, so the modern state, so everyone has a constitution. Sovereignty, meaning that they have absolute authority over their territory. Legislative monopoly, that means they have the exclusive right to make laws. Bureaucratic machinery, which means they have a bureaucracy. Every state has a bureaucracy administration. And then there's a cultural hegemony, which, and it's a long word, but it means that they establish a culture from the top of what they want people to think and behave and what they want them to like and dislike, all of what culture means. So that is also part of what it means to be a state. So essentially, also with the idea of a state, you need something that's closely related to it, but not the same, called a nation. So you have a state and you have a nation. And why we need a nation is because the concept of the modern state and its structure is really taking, the West took a Christian viewpoint on how to structure society, and they took all the Christianity out of it, and instead they kept certain elements, and one of the elements that they needed is that you need some kind of moral, or he calls it a metaphysic, something that you strive for that's not every day, it's something like emotional that you have an attachment to. And he says for the modern state, it is the concept of nation. And in fact, you see that translated, for example, people when they hear the national anthem, you'll find people crying, some of them very emotional, some people will do anything for the nation, true patriots, this is what is described. And so that idea of a nation is necessary for the state to have some kind of framework higher than the here and now. The everyday, it has to be something on a higher level, and that's what he calls a metaphysic. So sovereignty, so the idea of sovereignty, you have total control over your area. You also need a law. So sovereignty and law are connected. When you have total control, how do you establish that control? How does the will of the state get established? It is through law, okay? And so he said one point, which I think is important to mention. If the law of a state is given by another state or some other entity, that means the state is no longer sovereign. The state, if it's not establishing its own laws, then it's no longer considered a state. And his main point about the state in that regard also is that the state exists because of the state. It's a self-fulfilling circle. It doesn't require any higher power or it doesn't aspire to any higher purpose. Its only purpose is to exist as a state, and it is the supreme agent that sanctions violence in its territory. So it establishes the law, and it uses violence as needed to implement that law.
When we talk about this metaphysics, are we talking about a substitute for a moral good? When you mention this metaphysics, are we talking about some kind of a moral standard that otherwise would have been based on a religion? That's one issue. The second issue is Marxism did not see such a moral thing. They base it on the workers to be the elitists in this regard, which was never the case because the political party took place. So how does he address those two issues?
Yeah, so that's essentially that's what a metaphysic is. So physics is daily life, and metaphysics is religion, morality, something higher purpose, higher value than your everyday. And in this sense, when you have a state that has divorced itself from all religion, then it has to substitute what religion was providing. And in this case, it means a nation. And that's true whether it's communism, capitalism, any kind of system that the state is running. Ultimately, there is something about the citizen who feels an attachment to his nation and wants to defend that nation in some kind of higher moral value than just a day-to-day. And so, in fact, people will live and die for their nation, even if they necessarily don't believe in all communism. We had many Russians that very dedicated, for the Soviet Union, even though they realized the system itself is flawed and doesn't work. Why? Because they were attached to the nation, and that concept of a nation it drove them on a higher level to risk their life and limb and risk death. And so that is what the modern state has, is its religion, the idea of nationalism and a nation as a metaphysic. Does that make sense? Yeah. So bureaucracy we already talked about. There's obviously every state needs a bureaucracy. Separation of powers. There's a document, it's called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. 1789, France, they declared this, it's a short document, about 16, 17 different items, describing what is a state. Because obviously France is an important country to look at, because they basically established the parameters for the modern state, the first constitution, the Enlightenment, everything that went through there. And so many of the other states looked to France and what they had declared. So one of the things they said in that declaration is that a society that does not have separation of powers does not have a constitution, meaning that you need separation of powers between three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. In United States and everywhere, you would say that these branches are equal in power and mutually independent. This is the idea of separation of powers, according to this document. Of course, the US has many problems in separation of powers. For example, the Congress establishes a law, but then it has to be implemented by the executive branch. And so the executive branch then makes regulations. And so regulations and ordinances are basically like laws as well. So there's laws coming from the legislative branch, there's laws coming from the executive branch. And then the judicial branch also makes laws, because it sets up precedent. And once there's a precedent in a court case, that also becomes like a law. So in essence, you have multiple competing entities all making laws, so the separation of power it becomes much more blurry. And also, they imagined that these different branches would compete with each other, but in fact, politics took over more than the different branches. So, now we just have competition between Democrats and Republicans. And if they take over all three branches of government, for example, one party or the other, they tend to cooperate rather than compete. So the idea that you would have competition between these branches, it breaks down in actual modern implementation. So that's, unfortunately, he identifies that as a problem in the separation of powers. So he says that there is never such a thing as an Islamic state, that this is a modern construct. There was Islamic governance. He says that Ummah as a concept replaces the nation. The nation, the idea of nation, instead you have Ummah as the direct equivalent. Islam defines that wherever Sharia is implemented, that's Dar al-Islam, and wherever it is not, that's Dar al-Harb. So it has these two basic understandings. God is sovereign, meaning that in the state is sovereign. There's no higher entity than the state. But in an Islamic governance system, Allah is the sovereign. He's above even anybody who's running the state. And the Ummah, meaning the nation and the people, as a party, they're a means to an end, but not the end. Meaning the state itself is not the end all be all. Legislation by judges is interpretive, meaning that they interpret what was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala trying to tell us that we need to do. They look at the sources of Islamic law and they use ijtihad, and they interpret what is the law. And general moral principles are outside of people's control, meaning that in Islamic governance, ultimately we follow the Quran and Sunnah. That is not in anybody's direct control. And the Ummah is a single class, and their status as far as up and down is only known to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He knows who is more pious, and that is the one who is more and higher in rank. So he said these are some of the differences in Islamic governance. The state is not the repository of religious authority. In fact, the state is justified only to the extent that it promotes the efforts of the individual to obey and worship God. He quoted Sherman Jackson in that quote. In essence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Islamic governance system, we think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala owns everything. Hence, the property, for example, zakat is the right of the poor, since all wealth belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah's compassion is for the poor and the orphan and the downtrodden. So that's a sort of a fundamental viewpoint that the state has. And not all the states have this kind of viewpoint. So, for example, you have certain states where a pure capitalist system, it's whoever is fortunate enough to gain the most capital, he wins, and then whoever doesn't, then really, that's motivation for them to try harder. It's not really meant to be a welfare system, but that's not how the Islamic state was ever conceptualized. He said there's no Islam without a moral legal system anchored in a metaphysic, meaning that we anchor our beliefs in the Aqidah, in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and our legal system is anchored in a moral system, and anchored in a larger viewpoint about life, meaning that when we do anything, we recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the human being, that He gave us the guidance in terms of the Quran and the Sunnah, that He created us, that we will die, that we will be resurrected, that we will be judged by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we will send to either heaven or hell according to that judgment. All of that is a general metaphysic. This is kind of a way of looking at life, and there is no Islam without that. And he said there's no moral system without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being over top of it, meaning divinely sovereign. You can't have Islam without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being at the top of that system, in charge of everything. But he said there's no modern state that accepts that. There's no modern state that will accept something else to be more sovereign than the state itself. And he said that if that's true, then no modern state can be Islamic. In fact, modern states regulate religion and religious institutions. They set boundaries. They say this is what you can do as belonging to your religion. You can pray in this way and that way. You can pray in public. You cannot pray in public. You can establish this masjid here or that. They establish boundaries and control and regulate religion. He said in an Islamic governance system, it's the opposite. The Sharia regulates secular institutions because it's under the authority of the Sharia, everything. He says, moreover, another difference between Islam and Western governance is that the Sharia is not produced by the ruler, meaning there is nobody on top producing the Islamic law. The Ummah produces its own experts, and in fact, as his observation was that the experts of Islamic law, by and large, tended to be, more from the lower and middle class of society rather than the higher class of society, and so they were connected to the people on a very personal level. He went into a lot of detail about the difference between a qadi and a mufti. Okay, so a mufti is somebody who issues fatwa. He issues a legal opinion about what does the Sharia have to say about a question, a matter. He is a private legal specialist. So he said, let's look at what is a mufti. A mufti is a private person. He's a legal specialist. He is living in the community. He lives amongst the people. He's responsible to his community. He provides free consultation. Compared to Western legal practices, you have to spend so much money for the law, and this is free consultation. And eventually, through these questions that he's asked about what is the Sharia, what is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asking us to do or not asking us to do or forbidding us in this matter, these eventually become compiled into books, legal books. And so he said that anybody who went to a court in an Islamic court would never do that unless he had some kind of fatwa backing him, meaning that he had some kind of basis for his taking it to court. Otherwise, he would try to settle the matter informally, some other methodology. So even though these people are private citizens, private people, their opinions carry a very high weight. And in fact, he says that the qadi, who was actually the judge, many times they would send letters to various legal experts, muftis, asking for their opinion. Even people far away in other parts of the Islamic world, because they were renowned in certain areas, he would send them, he would write to them for their legal opinions. And he said in his analysis of Islamic courts that it was very rare for a judge to disregard a fatwa. He would have to, and so even though this is a private system, it becomes very authoritative. He said, on the other hand, the qadi, which means judge, he is trained in Sharia for sure, but he has many duties. So he said he has the duties to inspect the bridges, hospitals, schools, soup kitchens. He looks over the awqaf, the trusts. He looks over the care of orphans and the poor. He's a guardian for women. If they don't have a wali available, he becomes their wali for marriage. He arbitrates disputes, both formally in court but also informally between people. He records house sales, wills, estates, partnerships. And so all of this makes him aware of a larger social context. And ultimately, the interests of the qadi is to keep peace in the society, make sure that the society is tranquil and functioning appropriately, because he's living amongst the people. And he said the nature of Islamic law is that it was flexible and adaptable to local environments. So, for example, it could be used in Indonesia and Morocco. It could be used in Pakistan as well as America. Wherever the Muslims were, it became flexible and adaptable to that environment. It had an inner structure. That inner structure never changes, but it allows for changes over time with changing circumstances. So some things could change. And in fact, he said, when you look at Islamic legal textbooks over time, they reflect the variety of experiences of people over time and space. So it becomes a very rich corpus. And it is a law for the people, because as many of our scholars said, legal scholars, that the Sharia is for the benefit of the people. It's for the maslahah. And so ultimately, that is what the judges and the muftis are really interested in. What is the benefit of the people, and what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala want us from us?
Yeah. The question of the mufti and the judge, we know that the judge usually is supported by the, you might call it these days, police. He has power to execute, while a mufti is someone who is sitting in the masjid or sitting in his home and issuing those fatwa. I mean, how did he see this fatwa institution to have that much influence in regard to the state? Where do they fit? Yeah. I mean, the judge is clear, but where do the muftis fit?
Yeah, so of course, Professor Hallag is an expert in Islamic law. That's his original background, and he said in his analysis, a fatwa was rarely disregarded by a qadi, and so if the qadi has to issue a ruling, he will use one of these fatwa, but he has to stay within the bounds of these fatwa, unless he can independently, has the training enough to make his own ruling. So, in other words, he's more of an administrator, but he said that by and large, there was a moral authority for the Sharia, and so nobody could disregard it. Even the judge was compelled to live within its boundaries. And so he said, even though the mufti is operating informally, he has a tremendous amount of power. He said it's non-binding, but authoritative, meaning that there's authority behind it. So in fact, he mentions that the Orientalists have criticized Islam because they said there's not a separation of power. They said the judges are delegated by the ruler, and so there's no separation between judicial and executive powers. And he said this is incorrect because he said it is true they appoint and dismiss the judges and even limit their jurisdiction. These are over family law, these are general judges, so on and so forth. This was the authority of the Sultan, the Khalifa. But he said that their authority didn't extend to what the person would do, because ultimately that person still had to apply Sharia. And he said the Sharia is not something that came from the ruler. It is something that exists outside of the ruler, on top of the ruler's head. The ruler also has to deal with living under Sharia. So he said it's not a good, an equivalent concept that the judge is going to do whatever the ruler says. No, the judge also, he said that most judges were appointed for maybe 2 or 3 years, and by and large they also had other side businesses. They didn't really rely on this as their main source of income. And he said also the Qadi is the delegate of the Khalifa. But the Khalifa exists because he has wrested authority from the Ummah through the process of becoming Khalifa. So in other words, even though he's a delegate of the Khalifa, he's really a delegate who's by someone who's acting as a administrator or manager or as a representative of the community. So ultimately, it comes back to the Ummah itself. Yeah.
So is he referring to the historical fact, especially with the Uthmanis, to adopt the Hanafi madhab?
Yeah.
I mean, is he referring to, because like for example, if you go to Sharia courts, I saw some of the manuals that they use. Yeah. So basically, it's opinions. If it is, in the Hanafi madhab, this and that, or if they adopt the Shafi'i madhab, is this what he's referring to?
Yeah, well, he's saying, so essentially, yes, the state could adopt a madhab, but ultimately, even that is outside of the ruler's control, because what is the Hanafi madhab? Is the ruler defining the Hanafi madhab? No. He's just writing it down and maybe making it more formalized. But ultimately, that exists also outside of the control of the ruler. So what he's saying is essentially, if the Hanafis come up with a different opinion about a matter on their own, legal scholars, and through an analysis, the ruler is compelled to follow it. So, that's what he's saying, that the authority is not in his hands. Even though he has the authority to appoint and dismiss, but not the actual content of what's going on there. Other than, like you said, there was establishment of courts, but even that, he doesn't come up with the Hanafi madhab. He doesn't come up with the, yeah. In fact, he said that the concept of the ruler and the state, wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. He said that there was a concept of dawla, which is a dynastic rule. It was temporal and ephemeral. These are big English words, but basically he was saying that rulers came and went in the Islamic community, but ultimately the Ummah stayed and the Sharia stayed. So he said that the ruler was more of a caretaker than somebody who actually could guide, the law in the direction that he wanted to. He said it's true they didn't always stay in the bounds of Sharia, but the Sharia constrained them far more than the other way around. He said, in fact, Orientalists have this idea that Muslims are inherently submissive and have the capacity to endure tyranny and oppression, And this is actually, even in modern day, this is what they say about why they don't complain more about Muslims living under oppressive rule all over the Muslim world. Well, the Orientalists would say, well, that's just part of your personality, And in fact, they said that this is a hadith he quoted. That 60 years of tyranny is better than 1 day of strife. But he said that this is not really justified, because he said the sultans, they ruled from up high, and on the day-to-day, on the actual penetration to the society level, they required on a lot of other people to actually implement rule, and they relied on Islamic law. The sovereign in Islam is much weaker than modern rulers, because he had to enforce a Sharia that he did not make. As a result, he became more of a manager, and he actually defines what did the ruler of the Islamic State do. So he said that he enforces the Sharia and executes the rulings. He implements the hudud penalties. He maintains and raises armies. He defends the frontier and manages the roads. He divides the spoils of war. He collects zakat and distributes it. He appoints, supervises, dismisses qadis, muhtasibs, and the officers of the mint. And the muhtasib, anybody who's not familiar with this institution, was like a overlooker, caretaker of the marketplace. And so he had a very important role. So he would appoint and dismiss that person as well, and taking care of the orphans and the underprivileged. So he would have to follow the Sharia, but he would make some administrative rules to execute the duties properly. And in fact, in reality, he said that the Sultan, the Khalifa, his servants, which included the army, the police, and the administrators, would be subject to his laws, and everyone else to the Sharia, and that misconduct of officials would go to what's called the Madhalim court system, a court system specifically for people in power if they're abusing that power. And in fact, he said even Orientalists would admit that there were some edicts, meaning in Islam, that were so sacred that no monarch would prudently choose to violate them or show a wanton act of power. So of course the ruler is in charge, he can do whatever he wants, but the constraint of the Sharia was real, and even, he said, the Orientalists had to acknowledge that the rulers had to abide, by and large, by what the Sharia had commanded. And there was an accountability. So for example, they always had councils in governance that were comprised of all sorts of people, including wealthy people, merchants, regular council members, that, just like a normal city council. They had these councils where anybody could come and plead their case. And so there was a connection to the population always, a moral accountability. And he said there's no Muslim identity without a Sharia-defined ethic. The concept of God's sovereignty shaped the separation of powers. Law came from the ground up, not the top down. And he said that this is the Islamic system meets the definition of what John Rawls called a well-ordered society, and to a T, meaning this is what a well-ordered society should look like. So that's kind of the first part of the book. I don't know if anybody had any questions about that before I move on. Yeah, go ahead. Wa alaikum salam. Yeah. Well, this is a big topic. He said, the brother asked, how do we, how does Sharia get implemented again? And we believe in it, but we don't really follow it. That's kind of a larger topic. He doesn't go into it in the book to any large extent. He said this is something that that Muslims need to solve. In fact, the book doesn't give that many solutions. It just goes into analysis and differences. But I think that's obviously something that we need to look at. But one of the problems which he does talk about is that any modern state, basically the laws are coming from outside. And so really, if you think about it, the Muslim states in the world are really not sovereign states in essence, because their laws are being imported from other countries. The French law, the English law, the American law. And so the real idea of a state is it has to be sovereign. It has to have laws that come from itself and has to control its territory. And in essence, we look at all the Islamic state, the Muslim states, and none of them really fit that category where they're really sovereign states. They're kind of puppet states. So in essence, also he said that can't be really a mixture of these two legal systems. You either have the idea of Sharia where God is sovereign over everything and you look to the Sharia for your answers, or you don't. It can't be a mixture and match. So I think this is a dilemma, of course, but it's part of what he's talking about in terms of the structure of the state, and hopefully it will convince you of some of the advantages of Islamic form of governance. So he said one of the problems with Western society and rationalism and the Enlightenment is that basically they stated in a different fashion, but very similar to what the Mu'tazila said, that a man should be able to come up on his own to identify what is right or wrong. And that there are natural rights and a natural order. So they took away God's law and they said that there's a natural order and a natural law. And in philosophy, they say they separated fact from value. So this is a philosophical statement that they say. But in essence, what it means is that we've removed any value-based judgment on anything that we're doing. Meaning that you drink or you don't drink, that's up to you as far as your health or your well-being, but it doesn't have any meaning as far as you are obeying or disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It doesn't have any impact on you on the day of judgment. It doesn't have any kind of long-lasting or everlasting consequence, because you've removed all that idea of deen, of Allah, of any moral or religious reason why you're doing or not doing something. And so, in fact, what they said is that morality and ethics must rest on objective laws discovered by human reason. So in other words, they view their ethics and morality as something that they can come up with, and that was the rationalism idea. So that was, and that really, that's the fundamental basis for all of Western society, really. It's that man comes up with what is moral and ethical on their own, and doesn't rely on any other system other than intellect and to define that. And in fact, the Mu'tazila said something similar, but they were still bound by the Quran and the Sunnah. At least they were in the bounds of Islam, so they accepted that Islam had answers, but then they also were of the view that they could come up with what was good, what was hasan, what was kabih, what was beautiful, what was ugly, through some form of intellectual process. So they obviously also had interest in divine justice. So these were things very similar, but at least they were bound by a metaphysic, an aqidah, and a belief in the Day of Judgment. So, yeah.
I think what we need also to highlight that the difference between the two is that, although the Mu'tazila came up with this, that the human can recognize and judge what is hasan, what is qabih, what is accepted, what's not accepted, what's this, even though although the Sharia have discussed these things, but since they are acting within the bounds still of the Sharia, those values are not evolving. Yeah. While in the other side, who said that the human can decide what's good for them, you will see the values and the what is acceptable today is not acceptable tomorrow, and what's not acceptable. So how did he look at this difference between that view and the Western?
Yeah.
There's a fundamental.
No, there's obviously a big difference. Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. No, he doesn't really go into the Mu'tazila. I brought that argument because I said this is a vein that does exist in Islamic thought, but that has always been bound, as you said, by the Sharia as well. So it doesn't really drift the values too much from where they are. Whereas the Western system, like 10 years ago, there was no gay marriage. Now there's, it's totally allowed. I was in Ellis Island just for tourism earlier this year. They said the women, when they came over from Eastern Europe, they used to wear 14 layers of clothing. I don't know how they did it. 14 layers of clothing. And then when they got here, they were shocked at the American women and how little they were wearing. They refused to change their clothes because they were used to that system, So, in fact, this is what happens in the Western society. It keeps changing and evolving, and now you go to the mall and you're like, these people are wearing basically night clothes or something. I don't know what they're wearing. So you have to avoid going even to the mall. But that was interesting. These are all Christians. They were shocked by their own involvement. So in essence, is what you're saying, and what I'm saying is the same thing, but in essence that their underlying philosophical construct of what a society is and how you come up with what is right or wrong is dependent on your own intellect and through some other scientific method, which ultimately leads to constant evolvement and drift. So,
I guess that's why
Yeah.
Muslims in general, are shocked with those changes that are happening in the society. Because, people in the old days would see things and they do not see in their perspective, this is still a Christian country. But I guess the bulk of the shocks came in the changes in the last 15, 20 years, where there are major changes, and it's not just a change within the society, they are trying to impose them outside too.
That's right, yeah. Well, it's globalization and things of that nature that are transnational. And I'll go into that in a little bit. So Schmidt, as I talked about, one of the thinkers, he was actually a member of the Nazi Party, part of the, and later I think he migrated. But anyway, he said that power was the new God, meaning that the state the definition of the state and the actual meaning of the state in modernity is power. If it has political power, it is a state. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And in fact, many of us, the State Department and the U.S. government, they always promote democracy and human rights. But as anyone who's watched, U.S. foreign policy and activity over the years, you'll realize that if you actually measure, are they, acting according to democracy and human rights? Is that the actual, the main driver of their foreign policy? You quickly say that's ridiculous because whatever they do doesn't really have anything to do with that. And in fact, it is really power politics. If you analyze power politics and the striving for power, whoever is able to establish power, ultimately they deal with. For example, in Syria now, they're dealing with them. In Egypt, they blame them for something after the Arab Spring. Of course, these are superficial kinds of statements, but no matter how you look at it, ultimately the real the power politics which Schmidt talked about as being determinative. There are other things that you talk about. If all things being equal, can we promote democracy and human rights? Well, yeah, sure, but you still deal with China. China has, none of those factors. You still deal, so the determining factor is really not those values. And that's what Schmidt, one of the thinkers, talked about. So there's a form of state control. Let's see. So one thing he talked about is that the modern state, controls its citizens completely. And one of the evidences for that is conscription. So for example, any of us in a modern state can be anytime compelled to armed combat. So for example, here in the United States, at age 18, you sign up for the selective service. So anytime you can be drafted if they wish to serve in the army. And the same is true for most modern states. He said, in contrast, Islamically, there was never any conscription. In fact, you read the Quran over and over again, and you see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling people about they need to strive in the cause of Allah, and then you look at the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and all the history, and you see that they had to encourage people. There was a moral encouragement, and people, of course, did strive, but not everybody. If they didn't, we don't find anything about them being imprisoned or killed. They didn't join the army. So in fact, it was a moral imperative. But different from the modern state, which actually controls you. Puts you in prison if you don't fight. So he said the modern state compels violence on its citizens. So that's a very big difference. He said there's a moral technology. And so when he talked about that, he uses some of these terms which are a little harder to understand, but essentially he's saying that the modern state went to a higher level in terms of controlling its citizenry. It has its one principal goal is to maintain control of the population, primarily to enrich the elite. And he said there was a series of events that happened with this. So inequality in the wealth system led to violence, which led to the state having to establish a very well-staffed police force. So in fact, you look at the Islamic systems in the past, very few police, that's why, in fact, one of the, I was hearing Jonathan Brown talk about this idea of what is the hudud penalties. And he said one of the issues that we think of the Islamic system as the modern system, that you have this large police force that's out there regulating everything. But in fact, they hardly had many police at all. The modern state requires police. Why? Because there's so much violence caused by inequality. And when you have so much police, now you have a colossal prison system. So in fact, in a traditional, it's an Islamic governance, you didn't really have a very big prison system. You had some prisons, but not anything like, where we have here in every other county, there's a prison here. So the rise of police, the rise of inequality leads to the rise of a large police system, leads to the rise of a big prison system. And that's just the forceful way of controlling society. He said the second method of controlling society is by culture. So you mandate state schooling, and you acculturate every citizen with the culture of the state. And he said, he quoted this French thinker, Foucault. He said that it's not enough for the state to have control over your body, but rather they must control it so that the bodies operate as they wish with the techniques, speed, and efficiency that they determine. Meaning that they need to have a kind of almost a micro control over the human being. And in fact, when you see in China that at every intersection there's like 16 cameras or more, and that you have an app that tells you, if you have the right cultural equity to enter into certain buildings, otherwise you can't enter. When you get a ticket, you get automatically deducted the points on you get points on your system, but also you get negative cultural points. You're bad cultural. So that's obviously, you think of it like a very deep state Orwellian kind of thing. But in fact, every state, where did the Chinese come up with this idea? They came up with it from the Western states and their efforts to control their citizens. They just took it to another level. But he said that every modern state is basically striving for the same purpose, to control the population on this level. And you can see it here in America. We do the same thing in just a slightly different way. And he said the family was redefined as a unit of the state. The child became the battleground where reform is initiated and control is implemented. And you do that by, judges, teachers, psychologists, social workers, and they all work together to create this state citizen. So, I think nowadays we're battling with various states and nations about what our children will be taught. But in essence, that's the modern state. The modern state wants to define what its citizens think, how they behave, what is it that they like, dislike, how should they operate, and they do it in more or less coercive ways. Some people do it through more encouragement. Some people, for example, France actually, almost bans all homeschooling now because they don't want anyone learning anything outside of the state system, and they want certain values to be inculcated. But that is the modern state and how it operates. And as a result, there is the loss of the sacred, meaning there is a loss of morality. And when you have a loss of morality, it leads to the rise of narcissism. And in fact, the modern society elevates and reinforces narcissism. And he said the nationalism became the metaphysic, the religion of the state. So. Oh yeah. So Narcissus was, of course, very famous. I think I always get Greek and Roman confused, but anyway, he became so enraptured with his own, face that he looked at himself and he drowned. Because he saw in his reflection such a beautiful person in the reflection, and it's obviously these stories are meant to be kind of lessons. In the Greek Roman stories are meant to be lessons about what not to do or how dangers of these things. But that's narcissism. You love yourself so much, and of course, when you lose any kind of higher ethical or moral value, then the self becomes the one that you worship. And so, obviously, now you see that everywhere. TikTok, Instagram. Everybody, is trying to, have some kind of audience for people to look at them, people to pay attention, people to appreciate them. They want likes, and so these systems were designed to naturally feed on the idea of people's own narcissism. But the state itself basically elevates that, because it elevated the self in the beginning by making it the arbiter of right and wrong. And so the self became the God in the modern state, and it just keeps going from there. He talked about what is Islamic governance in terms of the self. First, he said the state did not control education in Islamic governance structure. Schools were private. They taught things that people needed, like language, Quran, hadith, logic, mathematics, science, whatever people needed to function in society. There was no state surveillance of the type or scope that we find today. In fact, he said the central problem in a modern state is the basic question of why be moral? In other words, when you've disconnected people from morality and religion and ethics, how do we promote them to act goodly? And what does that even mean? And so that is the dilemma of the modern state. They segregated morality from the law. And he states that morality as a separate entity from law is something that's innovation from the Western society. Because he said, if you look at Islamic legal textbooks, they have sections on ibadat and mu'amalat, but they're all in the same book. And in fact, these legal textbooks always start with tahara, they start with salah, they start with the 5 pillars, and then they go into mu'amalat. And he said, which of course is the law of interpersonal interactions, whether it's business or whatever types of interactions. And he said there was an important reason why. Because there can be no Sharia without a moral community. Meaning that if we don't believe that we were created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we don't believe that the Quran came as a guidance for us, and we don't believe that when we die we'll be judged for our actions, and we don't believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always looking at us and what we're doing, whether we're right or wrong, and will punish us and reward us accordingly, then the actual law itself is irrelevant, because the Sharia requires these things to work together. It's not just rules and regulations. In fact, he said that when the British came to India, they found the Sharia to be too lax. He said it was too easygoing. They needed something more harsh to establish over the population. Because the Sharia, in fact, gives you lots of excuses for lots of things, and that's what Professor Brown was saying, is that the hudud penalties were hardly ever enforced because there are a lot of reasons not to do it in the Sharia. But the point of why that system would work is because you have a moral ethic, a community. You can't have that exist without that kind of impetus in the society, where you're doing things not just because people are watching you, but because you have in your feeling that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching you, and you have this sincere belief. So he's saying that morality and law as two separate entities is really a Western invention. And in Islamic governance, the morality is the law, and law is morality. And so that's when we talked about the difference between what did some of the Ahl Sunnah say about the Sharia. They said the Sharia, whatever the Sharia commands is good, and whatever it forbids is evil. Whereas the Mu'tazila said something slightly different, that they could separately determine what is good and evil, but it's at the same time that it would correspond with what the Sharia said. So slightly different, but the idea about Islamic law is that whatever the law is moral, and whatever it is not moral. And that nobody can analyze Islamic law just by looking at the rules and regulations without understanding it as existing in a larger context of what it means to be a Muslim. So he talked about basically that Islam mastered technology of the self, meaning that Islam is always talking about, and he talked about Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, about his Ihya in this book, and he talks in detail about it, because he says that that kind of thing where somebody is taught, about themselves and how to control the self and how to control the desires and how to understand the self and how the self sometimes leads you into the wrong directions, and all of that is part of what Islam taught people and very much emphasized. Whereas the modern state, it doesn't emphasize that at all. It's just basically about the body. Man is just a political conquest, and there's a world that is devoid of any moral directives. And so that's, in essence, what he was talking about. The primary difference between, and I'll summarize this here now, is that the Western governance system, the Western modern state, exists for itself. It has no ethical or moral real directive. It has a power directive, and it exists to control its population. And you compare that to an Islamic form of governance where the state is not sovereign in Islam. It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who is sovereign. And so that always limits people from what they will do in terms of where they would take the state. And secondly, it allows far more freedom to people, because the state is not allowed to spy on people. It's not allowed to control people on the same level as a modern state is allowed to do. And in fact, there is a higher moral ethic that exists in society. He talks about economics in Islam and the idea that basically you're encouraged not just to earn money, but to earn money ethically, and to not exhaust yourself earning money, and to spend from your money on the poor. So in essence, the whole idea of economics in Islam also has a moral directive behind it. And so a totally different way of looking at economics. And in fact, I was reading a biography of Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak. And so his biography, he's, of course, some people called him Amir al-Mu'mineen of Hadith, Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak. And what he would do, he would travel all over the world, like all over the Muslim world. And he was very wealthy because he was a merchant. But his purpose behind traveling was to collect hadith, and that's all he would do. He would write them down in books. But along the way, he earned millions of dollars in today's terminology. And so, in essence, in his life, you can see what is the moral directive of the Muslim. That you earn money, and he said it to avoid getting humiliated by people. Meaning that he doesn't want to rely on people. But at the same time, the purpose of his money and his earning was to increase knowledge and really chase knowledge and to seek the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the two different views of why we earn money in the first place. So in essence, summary and contrast. Islamic governance. What is Islamic governance according to Hallag? It is the establishment of divine sovereignty where God's moral laws are translated into legal norms. There's a separation where the law is independent from other things. So there's a separation from, in other words, the law in Islam, it comes from the Sharia. The ruler does not really have that much to do with it. Legal and judicial powers are woven from a moral fabric, meaning everything has a moral value. And this is part of what he said in the West, is that they separated fact from value, or ought and is. Meaning that, for example, in nature, when we look at nature as Muslims, we see that this is a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that how we utilize it will be asked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this creation. And that, and that even in war, we're not supposed to cut off, randomly just to burn agricultural land or destroy nature. All of that's because of our view of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He will judge us for how we took care of nature. He said, but Western society, they removed any view of nature being attached to any larger moral understanding, and so then they exploit nature however they want. So that's, one of the problems of the modern state is that they destroyed, large parts of nature before they realized, we need this, this is we're going to destroy our environment. But he said the Islamic system, it has naturally, you're always connected to a larger ethic through Islam. I guess I'll just sort of end it there. I think the book is interesting. It's very useful, very dense, very hard to get through all of it, even though it's only 170 so pages. But it has very important points to make about the difference between the Islamic governance system and the modern state governance system. Now, again, he doesn't have very many solutions. One thing he did say is that, Islamic governance will have to look at the products of globalization, meaning that there's a global culture that is out there that's being exported to the whole world, and any Islamic governance, every Islamic state, if you want to use that term, will have to look at what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, because some of this stuff that's coming out is really meant to change the nature of the human being and change how they value things and actually change their whole personality into something that Islam would be totally against. So any Islamic governance would have to naturally exclude some parts of global culture and take what is less harmful. And I think he said that the main task is that we need to come up with a moral language that the West can understand, a way of looking at the world that can be translatable. And so this is what he was promoting at the end of the book. But again, not too many solutions, but that's one thing he said, that we need to come up with solutions to how we can explain Islam to others, but also how we can develop a common language allows us to exist and spread an ethic and morality of Islam in a way that can reach across boundaries and cultures. So I'll end with that. Anybody has any questions or comments? I think we have maybe 1 or 2 minutes for that. Yeah.
The term modern society or West is referenced several times in the book for what we have referenced right now. When did the West or the modern society as it's defined here, when did that start?
Yeah.
Who started it? And
So,
how was it started?
yeah, in essence, the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and that whole process of it lasted years, millions of people maybe died in this whole process in Europe, very bloody French Revolution, of course. And that is the establishment of the modern state, where you no longer have any kind of religious underpinning for society. And in fact, the ideology changes to humans have to come up with rules through objective measures and their own thinking. Yeah. I mean, that's the end point, but it started obviously years before in terms of very philosophers coming, building the groundwork for that idea. Yeah.
And later on they use institutions like the United Nations and others to bring this concept into a more international.
Yeah, that's what he was saying, that universalism, which is the idea that whatever they came up with should be a universal idea, is a failure. And he said, and Muslim liberals who carry that idea, they really have failed Islam itself by carrying that idea. Okay, Jazakallah.
Jazakallahu khairan wa barakallahu feek. This is the book, again, The Impossible State by Professor Wael Hallag. And we mentioned earlier, Wael Hallag is an Arab Christian who became a Muslim, which is something that is a taboo in the Arab world. PDF? It is available in PDF. Okay. It was sent to the class group. If you are not in the class group, you can ask Naji to add you. We have about 130, 140 people. So it's already sent the PDF for this book. جزاكم الله خير وبارك الله فيكم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.